The wind across the Arizona territory speaks a language of forgotten things, of sun-bleached bones, and promises broken like dry twigs. For Amelia Hayes, a woman haunted by the ghosts of a family she had lost, it was a constant, lonely hymn. But on one blood-red afternoon in the autumn of 1878, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the mesas in hues of blood and rust, that wind would carry more than just dust and sorrow. It would carry the sound of her world shattering again. It began with a rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, a sound that didn't belong. Amelia looked up from her vegetable garden, her hands stained with the rich, dark earth she had spent years cultivating. Two riders, their figures dark and menacing against the brilliant sunset, were deliberately driving a small herd of longhorn cattle toward her fence line. They were Floyd and Peterson Bartholomew Thorne's blunt instruments men, whose cruelty was as vast and empty as the landscape they rode upon. "That's far enough," Amelia shouted, her voice swallowed by the sheer scale of the valley. They ignored her. With a crack of a whip, Floyd drove the lead steer into the fence. The ponderosa pine posts set by her late husband David's own hands groaned and then splintered. The wire snapped with a metallic shriek. The cattle, wild-eyed and spooked, poured through the gap, their hooves churning her garden into a ruin of trampled squash and pulverized beans, the food she needed to survive the coming winter. She ran toward them, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but it was too late. The garden was gone. As the last of the cattle thundered through, a glint of white caught her eye. There, half buried in the mud and manure, lay the mangled remains of a small wooden bird. It was crudely carved, its wings chipped, but she would have recognized its form anywhere. David had carved it for their daughter Lily on her 5th birthday, just weeks before the cholera took them both. He had pressed it into Lily's hand, whispering, "So you'll always have a song, even when it's quiet." A cold white rage, sharp and clean, as a shard of glass pierced through the fog of Amelia's grief. She snatched the broken bird from the mire, its splintered wood digging into her palm, and marched toward the two men who now sat on their horses laughing. "That's a shame about your garden, ma'am," Floyd drawled, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was a big man with a florid face and small piggy eyes that seemed to absorb all light and reflect none. "Cows get restless this time of year." Amelia held up the broken toy. The sight of it, the last tangible piece of her daughter, her husband, her entire life back in Ohio, triggered a memory so sharp it stole her breath. The scent of carbolic acid and death. David, his face ashen, his strong hands trembling as he tried to spoon water between Lily's pale lips. The small wooden bird clutched in her feverish hand. "It's all right, my love." David had whispered, his own voice ragged with the sickness that was already consuming him. "Daddy's here." 3 days later, Amelia was burying them both, the little bird clutched in her own hand, and the silence of her home a roar that deafened her. The memory receded, leaving her standing in the Arizona dust, the broken toy, a testament to all she had lost then and now. Her voice, when it came, was no longer the quiet murmur of a grieving widow. It was the crack of a striking snake. "Get off my land." Peterson, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, shifted in his saddle. "Now ain't no call for that, Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Thorne, he's worried about you. A lone woman. It ain't safe. He just wants to help." If Mr. Thorne wanted to help, he'd keep his mongrels on a leash. Amelia said, her eyes locked on Floyd. She opened her palm, revealing the broken carving. "This was my daughter's." For a flicker of a second, something other than brutish amusement crossed Floyd's face. It was surprise, perhaps, that she would speak of something so personal, so sacred, in this place of dirt and violence. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Just a piece of wood," he grunted, though his smirk had vanished. "Mr. Thorne's offer still stands. $50 for this patch of dirt. Take it and go back east where you belong." "This is where I belong," she said, each word precise and dangerous. "This land is mine. The deed is filed. Now I will say it one last time. Get off My land. She didn't have the Winchester with her, but the force of her will was a weapon in itself. Floyd held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. He was weighing the satisfaction of doing more harm against the strange, unnerving resolve in her eyes. Finally, he tugged on his reins. "Have it your way," he spat. "But this land has a way of swallowing people who don't listen." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the heavy stench of their malice in the air. Amelia stood alone in the ruins of her garden, the setting sun casting her long shadow over the churned earth. She looked down at the broken bird in her hand, its tiny wooden wings snapped clean off. They hadn't just destroyed her sustenance. They had desecrated a memory. They had declared war on the ghosts she held dear. In that moment, she knew her quiet ending in the West was over. She had come here seeking a place to be unobserved, a place to let her sorrow quietly fade. But Bartholomew Thorne and his men had made a fatal miscalculation. They had mistaken her grief for weakness, her silence for surrender. They had trampled on the last remnant of her past, and in doing so, they had awakened a part of her she thought had died with her family. The unyielding strength of a doctor's daughter, a woman who could not, let another thing she loved be taken from her. The fight was no longer about 160 acres of stubborn dirt. It was about a little wooden bird and the sacred memory it represented. The weeks that followed were a slow-burning siege. Amelia replanted what she could, but the season was late, the soil damaged. Fear became a constant companion, a cold presence that sat with her by the fire at night. She slept with the Winchester rifle leaning against her bedside table, its cold steel a small and insufficient comfort. The world she had built to insulate herself from pain had become a prison of her own, making its vast, indifferent landscape now feeling like a cage patrolled by predators. One afternoon, a different kind of storm began to gather. The sky, which had been a placid blue, turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an oppressive energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A summer monsoon was brewing, a violent, life-giving tempest that could turn the dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes. Securing the shutters and herding her few chickens into their small, sturdy coop, Amelia felt that familiar pang of isolation sharpen into a knife's edge. Storms were the loneliest times, when the vastness of the land felt most like an accusation. As the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the hard-packed earth, she heard it. It was not the wind nor the rumble of distant thunder. It was a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural moan, almost lost in the rising gale. She froze her hand on the cabin door, straining to listen through the howl of the wind. There it was again, weaker this time, a piteous sound of pure agony. Common sense, the voice of survival that had kept her alive in this harsh land, screamed at her to go inside, bar the door, and ignore it. Out here, trouble found you easily enough without you going looking for it. It could be a wounded animal, a mountain lion, perhaps its pain, making it unpredictable and dangerous. Or worse, a drifter, one of the hard-eyed, quick-handed men who drifted through the territory like tumbleweeds, looking for an easy mark. But the sound was undeniably human. It carried a note of despair that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest, the echo of the sounds she herself had made in the dark, lonely nights after burying her family. Cursing her conscience, the stubborn, compassionate part of her she had inherited from her father, Amelia grabbed a heavy wool cloak and his old medical bag, its leather worn smooth, with a generation of use. The bag felt solid in her hand, a link to a time of purpose and healing. She hesitated, then took the Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall. Its weight was a grim counterpoint to the bag's promise of mercy. She followed the sound, heading toward a rocky outcrop a quarter-mile from her cabin. The rain was coming down in sheets now cold and blinding, turning the ground to a slick, treacherous mud. The wind tore at her cloak, whipping her hair across her face. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. There, wedged between two large sandstone boulders, lay the source of the sound. It was a man, a Navajo man, sprawled in an unnatural position. His face was ashen under his dark skin, his deerskin leggings torn and soaked in blood. One leg was bent at a horrifying angle, the sharp white of bone piercing through the skin. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder down his chest, a wound that spoke of claws, a mountain lion most likely. His breathing was a shallow, ragged hitching sound. He was young, probably no older than 25, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but his eyes were clouded with pain and the encroaching shadow of death. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. The tensions between the settlers in Redemption and the Navajo, the Dene as they called themselves, were a constant simmering threat. Bartholomew Thorne made no secret of his belief that the only good native was a dead one. He and his ranch hands treated the Dene with a contempt that often bled into open violence. To be found helping one, especially a warrior, would be seen as a betrayal. Thorne could use it as the perfect excuse to run her off her land, the land he coveted for its access to a year-round spring. They would call her an accomplice, an enemy, an Indian lover. The man's eyes fluttered open and fixed on her. There was no fear in them, only a flicker of surprise and a deep, weary resignation. He began to chant, his voice a hoarse whisper, the words of a death song meant to guide his spirit to the next world. He was giving up. In that moment, Amelia didn't see a Navajo warrior. She didn't see the politics of the territory or the hatred of Bartholomew Thorne. She saw the ghost of her husband, his face pale with fever. She saw the fading light in her daughter's eyes. She saw another human being slipping away, and the healer in her, the part of her that her father had nurtured, the part that grief had not yet managed to extinguish, rose up and refused to let it happen. No, she whispered as much to herself as to him. Not today. Making a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Amelia Hayes knelt in the mud, and the driving rain looked into the eyes of the dying stranger and prepared to fight death one more time. She was no longer a ghost hiding from the world. She was a doctor's daughter, and there was work to be done. Getting him back to the cabin was a monumental struggle. The warrior was wiry but dense with muscle, and every movement sent waves of agony through his body, causing him to cry out in a language she didn't understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. Amelia, hardened by the daily toil of homesteading, fashioned a crude travois from her cloak and two sturdy branches, dragging him inch by agonizing inch through the sucking mud. By the time she hauled him over the threshold of her cabin, she was shaking with exhaustion, her lungs burning, soaked to the bone. She laid him on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows that illuminated the severity of his injuries. The leg was a compound fracture, the bone piercing the skin, a breeding ground for infection that could kill him as surely as the cougar's claws. The gash on his chest was deep. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood. He was burning with fever, his skin hot and dry to the touch. For the next several hours, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the patient, the injuries, and the remedies. She worked with a desperate, focused intensity that was a legacy from her father. She could almost hear his calm, steady voice guiding her hands. Cleanse the wound first, Amelia. Infection is a patient killer. She cleansed the wounds with boiled water and harsh lye soap, ignoring the man's pained gasps. With a fine needle and gut suture, she stitched the gash on his chest, her hands moving with a surgeon's steady precision. The leg was the greatest challenge. Setting a bone like that was brutal, agonizing work. She gave him a strip of leather to bite down on. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were useless. Bracing herself, she pulled and manipulated the limb until the fractured ends of the bone aligned with a sickening grate. The man screamed a primal roar that was swallowed by the storm and then mercifully passed out. Working quickly, she packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding, and comfrey root, which her father had called knit bone, to encourage healing. Then she fashioned a splint from pieces of a broken crate and strips of linen, immobilizing the leg from his hip to his ankle. As the storm receded, replaced by the steady drumming of rain on the roof, the warrior's fever climbed. He thrashed in his delirium, muttering words in his native tongue, Dine Bizad. Amelia brewed a tea of willow bark, a potent fever reducer, and forced the bitter liquid between his lips a spoonful at a time. She sat by his side all night, bathing his face with cool water, changing his dressings, and listening. In the tortured ramblings of his fevered mind, she learned his name, or what she thought was his name, as he repeated it over and over. Hashki. Hashki. For 3 days, he hovered between life and death. Amelia barely slept, snatching moments of rest in a chair by the fire, driven by a deep-seated refusal to fail. This one would not die in her care. Not again. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She awoke to find him conscious, his dark eyes clear and watchful, tracking her every movement. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. He was a warrior of a tribe, hated by her people. She was a white woman living alone on land that had once been his ancestors. Yet in that small shared space, they were simply two people bound by an act of mercy. She offered him a bowl of thin broth, and he drank it slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. He gestured to his leg, then to her, a clear question in his eyes. "You were hurt," she said, speaking slowly, as if he might understand the tone if not the words. "A mountain lion, I think, and a bad fall. I found you in the storm." She pointed to the neatly stitched wound on his chest, then to the splint. "Your leg. It was broken. It will take time to heal." "A long time." He seemed to understand. He looked down at his splinted leg, then at the stitches, and a look of profound understanding crossed his features. He knew the severity of his injuries. He knew that alone in the wilderness, they would have been a death sentence. He had been singing his death song, prepared for the end, and this strange woman with the sad eyes and gentle hands had pulled him back from the brink. He gave a single slow nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, and of respect. A week later, just as a fragile routine was beginning to form between them, trouble arrived. It was Floyd and Peterson again. Amelia saw them from the window, her stomach clenching into a tight, cold knot. She met them on the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her hands, its presence a clear warning. "Morning, ma'am," Floyd said, his cruel smirk firmly in place. "Mr. Thorne was just wondering if you'd seen any trouble out this way. Heard there was a Navajo buck spotted near here a week or so back. Word is he tangled with a cat and lost." Amelia's face was a neutral mask. "The only trouble I've seen is the kind that rides up on horseback when it's not welcome." "Now, Mr. Thorne," he worries. Peterson whined, his nervous twitch more pronounced than usual. "You can tell Mr. Thorne I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," she said, her voice like ice. "Now, if you're finished being neighborly, this is private property." Floyd's smirk widened. His eyes flickered toward the cabin door, as if he could see through the wood. "Heard a rumor you were some kind of healer. Fixing up strays. Just wanted to make sure you ain't fixing up the wrong kind of stray." Mr. Thorne wouldn't take kindly to that. Not at all. The threat was unmistakable. Someone had found the site of the attack, seen the tracks of one person being dragged away, and put 2 and 2 together. "I have a guest in my home," Amelia said, her voice dropping, each word precise and dangerous. "He is a sick man, under my care. He is not your concern. You will leave now." For a moment, Floyd looked as if he might dismount and force the issue. His hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip. Amelia raised the barrel of the Winchester just an inch. their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. From inside the cabin came a faint sound and the scrape of the splint moving across the floorboards. Floyd's gaze darted to the door again, and the smirk returned triumphant this time. He had his confirmation. "Have it your way, ma'am," he drawled, pulling on his reins. "But I'd be careful. Sometimes a sickness can spread to the whole neighborhood." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of dread. Amelia stood on the porch for a long time, the rifle feeling heavy in her hands. She had made her choice in the storm, an act of simple humanity. But she knew with chilling certainty that Bartholomew Thorne would not see it that way. He would see it as an act of war. The debt she was paying for a stranger's life was only just beginning to be tallied. In the weeks that followed, an unspoken understanding grew within the small cabin. Hashki, though still weak, was a man of immense pride and resilience. He watched everything Amelia did, his intelligent eyes taking in the rhythms of her solitary life, the way she tended her recovering garden, the skill with which she mended her clothes, the weariness that sometimes settled on her face. When she thought he wasn't looking, he saw her strength and he saw her loneliness. They communicated in a tapestry, woven from gestures and shared glances. She would speak to him in English, telling him about her day, about the hawk that nested in the tall pine, about the memories of her father's clinic. She didn't know if he understood the words, but he listened, his attention unwavering. It felt good to hear her own voice, filling the silence, to speak to someone other than the ghosts of her past. His healing was slow. The gash on his chest closed into a clean pink scar. His leg, however, was a different matter. She knew it would be months before he could put his full weight on it, and he might walk with a limp for the rest of his life. For a warrior and hunter, it was a devastating blow, a heavy weight that hung unspoken in the room between them. One crisp morning, Amelia's next trip into redemption was a necessity. Her supplies were dangerously low. The town, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, had always been a place of transactional acquaintances. Today, it was a gauntlet of hostility. As she walked toward the general store, conversations ceased. People turned their backs. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, a man who had always been civil, served her with a grim face. His movements were clipped, his answers curt. When she tried to pay, he slid the coins back across the counter. "We don't want your money here, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your credit is no good in redemption." Stunned, she looked around. Faces stared back at her, a mixture of fear, suspicion, and naked hostility. Old Mrs. Gable, a woman for whom Amelia had once prepared a salve for arthritis, pulled her children close as if Amelia herself were a disease. The final blow came from Bartholomew Thorne. He was standing outside the saloon, flanked by his men, a smug look of victory on his face. He was a powerfully built man in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and left out in the sun too long. "Seems you've worn out your welcome, Mrs. Hayes," he boomed, ensuring everyone could hear. "Decent folk don't take kindly to those who aid and abet murderers and thieves." He gestured vaguely toward her homestead. "That land you're squatting on, it's prime grazing land. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. Say $50 enough to get you on a stagecoach out of this territory." The offer was a public insult, a display of his power. "My deed is filed and legal, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The land is mine." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Deeds can get lost. Fires happen. Accidents happen too. Especially to women living all alone so far from town." He leaned closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "I've dealt with people like you before. Coming from the East with your fancy words and your high-minded notions, thinking you know better than the folks who carved this place from nothing. This land has rules. You'd be wise to learn them." He straightened up. "I'll give you until the end of the month." Amelia walked back to her wagon, her head held high, but her heart felt like a stone in her chest. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. "I've dealt with people like you before." It felt like more than just a threat. It felt personal, steeped in a history she couldn't comprehend. She had been utterly and completely cast out. The following weeks were a torment. Her new fence was cut. The well she depended on was fouled with a dead animal, and she spent 2 days cleaning it out, her body aching, her spirit flagging. Fear was a constant companion. She slept with a Winchester by her bed, starting at every creak of the floorboards. The loneliness she had once sought as a comfort had become a terrifying vulnerability. One bleak afternoon, pushed to her breaking point, Amelia sought solace in the one thing that connected her to a better time, her father's medical bag. She ran her hands over the worn leather and the scent of antiseptic and old paper clinging to it. As she cleaned and oiled the brass clasps, her finger caught on a loose bit of stitching in the lining. Curious, she worked it open and found a hidden compartment. Inside was a small oilskin-wrapped packet. Her hands trembling, she unwrapped it. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile, from the Ohio Chronicle, dated 1858. The headline read, "Local Doctor a Hero in Cholera Epidemic." The article praised the tireless efforts of Dr. Alistair Hayes, who had worked day and night to save countless lives during the brutal outbreak that had ravaged their county. She felt a swell of pride, a bittersweet memory of her father's quiet dedication. Then her eyes fell on a smaller paragraph at the bottom of the column. It was a list of the deceased. The article noted with particular tragedy the complete loss of one family who had recently arrived from the east, traveling west. A man, his wife, and their 2 young children, all taken within a week. The family's name was Thorne. The air left Amelia's lungs. Thorne, not a common name. From the east. "I've dealt with people like you before, coming from the east. It couldn't be a coincidence." Her father hadn't just worked during that epidemic. He had been the only doctor in that part of the county. He would have been the one to treat Thorne's family. The conflict wasn't about land. It wasn't about a spring. It was a 20-year-old vendetta, a festering wound of grief and hatred that had followed her across the country. Thorne didn't just want her land. He wanted to destroy Alistair Hayes' daughter. He was finishing a battle that in his mind had begun at the deathbeds of his wife and children. The stakes had just been raised from her home to her very existence. He wasn't just a bully. He was a man avenging ghosts. 2 months after his arrival, Amelia woke to find Hashki gone. The pallet by the fire was empty, the blankets neatly folded. Panic seized her first, a cold, sharp fear that Thorne's men had come in the night. She rushed outside. The ground was still damp from a pre-dawn shower. There, leading away from the cabin, was a single set of tracks, one clear footprint, and beside it the deep drag mark of a crutch. He had fashioned a crude crutch and left on his own. A feeling of profound and unexpected abandonment washed over her. It was foolish. She knew he couldn't stay forever. But his silent, constant presence had become a buffer against the crushing loneliness. Now the silence of the cabin was deafening again. He had left without a word, without a farewell. The end of the month arrived with the chilling finality of a death sentence. The late autumn air had a sharp, brittle edge. Amelia had sent word back with a passing trapper that the land was not for sale. It was an act of defiance she knew would have consequences. They came in the late afternoon when the sun was low, casting long, menacing shadows. It was Thorne himself with a dozen of his men. They were a posse of vigilantes, their faces grim, their intent clear. They carried rifles, coils of rope, and unlit torches. Amelia watched them approach from her window, her heart a frantic drum. This was it. She was one woman against 13 armed men. The Winchester felt impossibly heavy. Thorne reined in his horse just beyond her ruined fence line, his men fanning out behind him in a semicircle, cutting off any chance of escape. Amelia Hayes, he bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet afternoon. Your time is up. We gave you a chance to leave peacefully. You chose to side with savages, so you'll be treated like one. We're claiming this land in the name of the decent folk of redemption. You can walk away now with your life, or you can be cleared out with the rest of the trash. Amelia stepped out onto the porch. She did not raise her rifle, but held it across her body, a symbol of defiance. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had lost everything once before. She would not let this man see her fear. This is my home, Thorn. She called back, her voice clear and stronger than she felt. You have no right. Thorn laughed. Right out here, woman, we make our own rights, and we don't make them for traitors. He nodded to Floyd and Peterson. Take the door. The rest of you get your torches ready. Floyd and Peterson dismounted, cruel grins on their faces. They started toward the cabin. Amelia's knuckles turned white on the stock of her rifle. The world shrank to the space between her and the two advancing men. Time slowed to a crawl, and then it happened. It started not with a sound, but with a shift in the light, a flicker of movement on the high ridge that overlooked her homestead. Thorn saw it too. He paused, his hand raised, squinting into the setting sun. One by one they appeared, silent figures on horseback, materializing as if from the very rock of the ridge itself. They were Navajo warriors, their forms silhouetted against the blood-red sky. First 10, then 20, then 50. They kept coming, pouring over the crest of the hill in a silent, inexorable tide lining the entire length of the ridge. They were armed, not for hunting, but for war, with rifles, bows, and lances. Their faces, painted with the stark symbols of their clans, were impassive, unreadable stone masks. There were 200 of them. A gasp went through Thorn's men. Horses shifted nervously, sensing the sudden, palpable tension. The confident smirks vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief and primal fear. The valley, which moments before had held only Thorn's blustering voice, was now filled with a silence so profound it was a physical weight. At the center of the line, two figures moved forward. One was an older man, with a face like a weathered map, his long gray hair braided with eagle feathers. He sat on his horse with an undeniable air of authority. Beside him sat a younger man, straight and proud. One of his legs was braced in a new, expertly crafted support. It was Hashki. He met Amelia's gaze across the distance, and for the first time, she saw him not as a patient, but as who he was, a leader, the son of a chief, a man of power among his people. He raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a sign of acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes. I did not abandon you. The chief then raised his own hand palm open. His voice, when it came, carried across the valley with breathtaking clarity. Another warrior beside him translated the English words, ringing out like a hammer on an anvil. Bartholomew Thorn, you stand on land that is protected. The woman who lives here is family to the Dene. She practices the sacred way of Hojo, of balance. She saved the life of my son. This is a debt of honor, and we have come to pay it. He paused. She does not stand alone. Her fence is our fence. Her well is our well. Her home is our home. A threat to her is a threat to every one of my warriors. Look upon this ridge. We are her family now. Thorn was apoplectic, his face a mask of purple rage. But he was also a pragmatist. He looked at his 12 men, then up at the 200 silent, heavily armed warriors who held the high ground. It wouldn't be a fight. It would be a slaughter. Hashki had not simply gone home. He had returned and told his father, Natani, the great chief of the woman with sad eyes, who had fought death for him in a lonely cabin. And his people had answered the call of a life debt. Thorn stared at the ridge, then at Amelia, his eyes filled with a new venomous hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, his brute force rendered impotent by an ancient code he could never comprehend. "This ain't over." He spat the words almost a whisper of fury. He yanked hard on his horse's reins, wheeling it around. "Let's go," he snarled at his men. Without another word, the posse turned and rode away, their retreat hasty and ignominious. Amelia stood on her porch, the Winchester hanging limp in her hand, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She looked up at the ridge, at the 200 silent sentinels watching over her. She had saved one dying man, and in return, he had brought her a family. The silence they offered was no longer one of loneliness, but of unwavering, absolute protection. This strange, unprecedented alliance did not go unnoticed. News of the standoff traveled fast. The narrative that reached Fort Defiance, the nearest U.S. Army outpost, was a twisted and dangerous version, carefully seeded by a humiliated Bartholomew Thorne. He painted a picture not of a personal grudge, but of a massive security threat, a renegade white woman arming the Navajo, inciting them to violence, and creating a private army. The commander dispatched a patrol led by Captain Robert Sterling, a career soldier and a veteran of the Bloody Plains Wars. Sterling was a man who believed in order and the letter of the law, and he held a deep-seated, weary suspicion of all native tribes. He rode toward Amelia's homestead, expecting to find the crucible of a new war. Sterling arrived with a full company of 20 cavalrymen, their blue uniforms a jarring sight in the rugged landscape. Amelia met him on the porch, but this encounter felt different. Sterling was not a thug. He was an instrument of a power far greater and more dangerous. "Mrs. Amelia Hayes." He asked, his voice formal and devoid of warmth. "I am Captain Robert Sterling, United States Army. I'm here to investigate reports of an illegal militia being formed on this property and collusion with hostile natives." "There is no militia here," Captain Amelia replied, her voice steady. "And no hostility, except that which was brought to my doorstep by Bartholomew Thorne. My reports state that over 200 armed Navajo warriors confronted Mr. Thorne on this land." Sterling countered, his skeptical gaze sweeping over her small cabin. "They have established a permanent encampment nearby." "Why would they do that for you? The Navajo are not known for their altruism toward settlers." "Because I saved the life of one of their own," she said simply. "It's a matter of honor. Something Mr. Thorne knows nothing about." Sterling's lips thinned into a hard line. "Mrs. Hayes, you are walking a very dangerous line. I am placing you under formal investigation. You are not to leave this property. My men will be making camp nearby to monitor the situation. I suggest you tell your friends to disperse. Their continued presence is considered an act of provocation by the United States government." He wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men. Amelia had escaped the grasp of a greedy rancher, only to fall into the jaws of the U.S. Army. Her unlikely alliance, born from compassion, was now being framed as an act of treason. Days turned into a week. The valley a powder keg with 3 factions, the stoic Navajo, the disciplined cavalry, and one determined woman, watching and waiting. The tipping point came not with a gunshot, but with the weather. A massive sandstorm, a haboob, began to build on the horizon, a churning wall of brown that would swallow the world. Thorne, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. Using the mounting chaos of the storm as cover, he and his men rode for Amelia's cabin, intending to end things once and for all, convinced the cavalry would be pinned down and the Navajo blinded. But Captain Sterling was not so easily deterred. Worried Thorne might do something foolish, he rode toward the homestead himself, getting separated from his men just as the storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a screaming, blinding vortex of sand and wind. Thorne and his men burst into Amelia's cabin just as Sterling, disoriented and half-blinded, stumbled in behind them, seeking the same shelter. The 3 sides of the conflict were suddenly trapped together in the claustrophobic space of the small room. Outside, the storm howled. Natani Hashki and their warriors, who had moved closer to protect Amelia, now faced off against the remainder of Sterling's company in the maelstrom. Two armies poised to destroy each other, waiting for the wind to die. Inside, the air was thick with tension. "It ends tonight." Hayes Thorne snarled, his face demonic in the flickering lantern light. "It ended 20 years ago, didn't it?" Bartholomew Amelia said quietly, her discovery of the newspaper clipping giving her a strange, cold calm. Thorne froze. "What did you say?" "Ohio, 1858. My father was Dr. Alistair Hayes." A mask of pure, unadulterated hatred twisted Thorne's features. The veneer of the civilized cattle baron dissolved, revealing the raw wound beneath. He watched them die. He hissed, his voice cracking with ancient pain. "My wife, my boy, my little girl." He stood there with his useless tinctures and his fancy words while the fever took them. He called it medicine. I called it murder. He took my world from me in Ohio. It's only fitting I take yours from you here. He lunged for her, but Sterling, shocked by the confession, moved to intervene. At that exact moment, the cabin door creaked open, admitting a silent, dust-caked figure. It was Hashki. He had slipped through the storm, a ghost in the wind. He looked at Thorne, then at Amelia. He pointed a finger at Thorne, then made a gesture of a man weeping, and then pointed to the sky, a sign for the Great Spirit for the past. He then pointed to Amelia's medical bag, which sat on the table. He touched the unique silver clasp on its front, a stylized serpent eating its own tail, and then pointed to himself, and then to Natani, his father. He spoke his English, broken but clear words he must have practiced endlessly with his people. "Grandfather. Story. Your father, doctor, came. Saved my people. Same fever, same time." He pointed again to the silver clasp on the bag. "Grandfather, see this. On bag. Doctor with sad eyes. Saved us." The secondary twist landed with the force of a physical blow. Captain Sterling stared at the bag, then at Amelia, his entire worldview shattering. Hashki's people, it turned out, were originally from a region in Ohio, not far from where Amelia grew up. Driven west decades earlier, they had carried with them the oral history of their survival, the story of a white doctor who, during the Great Sickness, had not only treated the settlers, but had crossed boundaries of race and fear to save a small, isolated Navajo encampment from annihilation. Thorne's family had been tragically lost, but countless others, including Hashki's own ancestors, had been saved by that same man. Thorne's vendetta, the central pillar of his life for 2 decades, was built on a lie born of unbearable grief that had twisted a hero into a villain. No. Thorne whispered, his face ashen, seeing not an enemy in Amelia, but the daughter of the man who had tried and failed to save his family while succeeding in saving so many others. The hatred that had fueled him for so long sputtered and died, leaving only the empty, pathetic shell of a broken man. As the storm outside began to break, so too did the conflict within the cabin. The truth, finally unearthed, was more powerful than any weapon. The aftermath was swift. When the wind died and the dust settled, Captain Sterling emerged from the cabin, his face grim and resolute, with Bartholomew Thorne in custody. The sight of the powerful cattle baron being arrested by the U.S. Army stunned both the remaining cavalry and the assembled Navajo warriors into a silent tableau. The law, so often a tool for the powerful, for once served justice. Stripped of his influence, his crimes laid bare by Captain Sterling's official report, Thorne's empire of fear crumbled. Floyd and Peterson confessed to everything. Captain Sterling remained in the valley for another week. He made a formal visit to Amelia's cabin, removing his hat as he stood on her porch. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "My orders were to prevent a conflict. I see now I was on the verge of starting one. I misjudged you." He looked toward the foothills where the Navajo were camped, I have been speaking with Chief Natani. I am learning that honor is not always written in a field manual. Before he left, Sterling posted an official notice countersigned by the territorial marshal, declaring Amelia's homestead a protected property. The town of Redemption, fickle in its loyalties, slowly began to change its tune, viewing Amelia with a new grudging respect. Her truest family remained the Dene. Her bond with them, forged in crisis, deepened into genuine kinship. Hashki, walking now with a pronounced but dignified limp, became a regular visitor. They taught her the healing properties of plants she had never known and the stories of their people. She taught them from her father's medical texts. She was no longer just the healer. She was a student. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, Amelia walked to the two small weathered crosses on the hill behind her cabin. She knelt and placed the broken wooden bird on Lily's grave. As she did, Hashki approached his footsteps, soft on the earth. He held out his hand. In it lay a newly carved bird, an eagle, its wings spread wide, its eyes sharp and clear, a symbol of vision, strength, and rebirth. He had made it for her. She took it, her throat tight with emotion. With a slow, deliberate movement, she placed the eagle on David's grave. The broken past and the healing present, side by side. She was bridging the family she had lost with the one she had found. A year later, a traveling doctor named Albright, passing through Redemption, heard the legend of the healer of the canyon. Intrigued, he made the long journey to her homestead. He expected to find a reclusive hermit. Instead, he found a thriving hub of life. The garden was replanted larger than ever. A small outbuilding had been converted into a clean, organized clinic. Inside, he found Amelia not alone, but surrounded by a small, attentive group of settler and Navajo children. Using her father's books and charts, alongside bundles of native herbs, she was teaching them the basics of botany and medicine, seamlessly blending two worlds of knowledge. She had found her true calling not as a widow hiding from the world, but as a teacher and a bridge between two cultures. She had built a new life, a legacy of healing that honored her father's true memory and forged a new future of peace in the valley. Amelia Hayes had come to the West, seeking a place to be forgotten, a place to let her story end. Instead, she had found the one place on earth where it could truly begin.